There once was a boy who grew up in poverty. This took place in the 1700s in Great Britain specifically, and he was one of 10 children. So obviously his mom stayed at home to watch over all the kids while his dad was a preacher who made very little money. In fact, his dad was placed in prison a couple of times because of his enormous debt load and failure to often pay what he owed. However, this boy was determined to not end up in the same financial turmoil that he was accustomed to growing up. So he later enrolls into college, and he went on to teach at Oxford University. So now that he had a life of splendor, he often splurged his money on card games, tobacco, brandy, and just getting lost in the world. However, on one cold, wintry night at Oxford, this man had just finished paying for some really fancy pictures to hang up in his room when one of the chambermaids came to his door. And he noticed that this maid had nothing to really protect her from the harsh, cold weather other than a thin linen gown while she worked. So having compassion, this man reached into his pocket to give her some money to buy a coat, but he found he had too little left to give her after spending money on pictures. And it was right then that he was struck with this thought that God was not pleased with how he had spent his money. And it's recorded that this man then asked this of himself: "Will my master say, 'Well done, good and faithful steward'? You have adorned your walls with the money which might have protected the poor creature from the cold. Oh, justice, oh, mercy, are not these pictures the blood of this poor maid?" From that moment on, this man took a completely new approach to how he went about his finances, his budgeting, and his spending. So his income in the 1700s in Great Britain was about 30 pounds a year. And he found that he could live off of 28 pounds a year and then give away the remaining 2 pounds. So what that looks like in today's dollars is that he could live off of $20,000 a year and then gave away that extra $1,500 to just the poor and those who needed it most. Then the next year, his income doubled to 60 pounds, amounting nearly $50,000 a year, and yet he's still committed to live off of $20,000 a year and gave the remaining 32 pounds or $30,000 away. And then the next year, his income rose again to 90 pounds, roughly $66,000 a year, and yet he continued to live on $20,000 a year, giving away the additional remaining $46,000. And then the next year, his income increased again to 120 pounds, making now close to $90,000, and yet he still lived off of $20,000 a year, giving away $70,000 to those who needed it most. And eventually, this man went on to make 1,400 pounds a year. That's the equivalent of $160,000. And his living expenses did increase up to 30 pounds, up from his previous 28 pounds. So he was living off of the equivalent of $22,000 at one point and gave away the remaining $140-some thousand to the poor and those in need. This man would go on to make about 30,000 pounds during his lifetime, the equivalent of $21,420,000, and he wound up just giving away the vast majority of his life earnings. You're probably wondering, who was this guy? Who was this man? Well, this man was none other than John Wesley, who was the founder of the great Methodist movement in Great Britain that eventually led to the start of the Methodist Church, which eventually produced this little offshoot denomination called the Wesleyan Church, which is a denomination that Resilient Church is a part of. Talk about a radical life of sacrifice and generosity, right? Radical. And the only way that John Wesley was able to practice such radical generosity was because he chose to invest his money into bringing heaven closer to earth, because that's what ultimately captivated his heart the most. So we're in week 3, wrapping up this series called Cash App, where we're talking about money. We're talking about money. And this whole series, we've really been wrestling with like, how does God view our finances and how does he call us to not only be good stewards of our finances, but also how can we use our finances to fund his redemption movement, particularly found in the local church. So just a little bit of a recap. You can go back and listen to any of these on our podcast episodes. You can just scan that QR code on one of those Connect cards. It brings you to a website where you can then scroll down, find our podcast, and you can do Apple Podcast, Spotify, whatever, wherever you consume your podcast needs. But just to quick recap, in week 1, we talked about the system of giving. So ever since the Old Testament, God had his people set aside a portion of their harvest and their finances to help provide for his redemptive movement to reconcile their sins so they can be in relationship with God again. And we specifically looked at how the tithe and the financial offerings that we get at Resilient Church helps make this thing function. We took a deep dive into our financial earnings and kind of where we're at in the grand scheme of things so that we can see ourselves be sustained for the long term, particularly by looking at this system of giving. That was what we covered in week 1. And then last week, in week 2, we talked all about the amount that we should give. Because you look at the tithe, right, from the Old Testament, T-I-T-H-E, it just stands for 10%. That typically is the good baseline that we can work towards when it comes to giving to the local church. 10% of your income is what we give to the local church. But we also talked about, though, that while that's a good baseline to aim for some people, 10% would completely break the bank. So we need to wrestle with what does it look like to sacrifice in proportion to our earnings. But that also goes to the flip side too, because there might be some people who've been really blessed and can live off a lot less, and maybe they're called to give more than 10%, right? It's all in proportion to our circumstances and our particular sacrifice that we're called to give. So our generosity isn't so much about the amount that is given, but our obedience to follow through with the generosity that God has called us to give. But today, wrapping it up by going one step deeper. So we've talked about the system of giving, we've talked about the amount of giving, but now we're talking about the heart of giving. And we come back, we circle around to this key phrase that's just been so crucial to this series, and it's this, that God doesn't want your money, he wants your heart. And since our heart is often consumed by our money, God uses our money to fund the ministry that changes our hearts. That's the economy of redemption right there. So, let's dive in. What does God's word have to say about the hearts of our finances, generosity, and giving? So if you got your Bibles, you can turn with me to Matthew chapter 6. Again, that is Matthew chapter 6. If you have a Bible or a Bible app, you can go ahead and turn there now, just to give you some context of what this passage is about. It's taking place right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. This is a large collection of some of Jesus' most powerful teachings. In the grand scheme of things, the Sermon on the Mount is all about how can we live righteously? How can we live a holy life as God has called us to live? Okay? And one of the things that we are to do if we want to live like his son, Jesus, comes down to how we steward our finances and how we go about our money. So that is what this passage is all about. Let me tell you, his words cut straight to the heart, truly. So let's pick up chapter 6, beginning in verse 19. And I'm reading in the New Living Translation. Don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. So the key truth in this passage is pretty simple. And it's that our money follows our hearts. Our money goes where our hearts go. So in Jewish culture, the heart wasn't just this like metaphor for the emotions that we feel, right? The heart was something much deeper. It was something that captivated our deepest passions. It encapsulated our deepest desires, all of our wants. Our entire selves was summed up in the heart. In the heart. It ultimately revealed everything that we wanted to do to drive our life forward. And so in verses 19 and 20, Jesus describes two categories for where we ultimately store treasure in our hearts. where we put our money in. You could say that these are two different kind of accounts that we invest our money in, so to speak. And the extent to which we store our money in either of these two accounts reveals the nature of our heart's desires. Because a really key question that we ask ourselves is, what does our spending reveal about our heart's desires? What does our spending reveal about our heart's desires? If you were to go over and look at your last month's worth of expenses, how would that paint a picture of what our heart is? If you looked at our spending expenses this last month, you'd be like, we're all about housing projects and trying to renovate our home, because that's like literally taking up our entire budget right now, you know? But it gives you a good snapshot of the things you value, of where your money goes. And so in light of these two main categories that Jesus reveals to us, we either store our money or our treasure on earth or in heaven. We either put it in the account of earthly investments or heavenly investments. Okay? What's that about? Because where we put our treasure will reveal what our hearts ultimately value. So let's talk first about storing our treasure up here in earth. What does Jesus mean by this? Okay? So according to Jesus, earthly treasures are things that moths eat, rust destroys, and thieves steal. Earthly treasures are things that moths eat, rust destroys, and thieves steal. So let's break each of these three things down. Here's a cool picture of a moth. Look at that guy. Moths are so cool. They're like the fuzzy cousins of butterflies, you know? And yet this little guy is condemned in the ancient world for being a destroyer of all good things. Why? Like, this little guy? How could this guy be such a huge threat? It was because even the finest garments one could own could be destroyed by this harmless little moth who just wants a little midnight snack. You could lose all your money on the fanciest of clothes, and you could wake up with holes in it because of a moth. Right? So it's this metaphor of the destroyer of the most basic materials of life. Or when Jesus goes on to talk about the rust that destroys, he's referring to the general deterioration of everything eventually. Everything breaks down eventually. Nothing truly lasts forever. You will always have to get more food. You will always have to get a new phone. You'll always have to get a new car or a new toolkit, or you have to update your house, and so on and so forth. Everything breaks down eventually, and everything eventually gets replaced by something better, faster, and shinier. So the sad truth is, everything you own will become garbage eventually. Everything will. So lastly, Jesus refers to the thief who steals, someone who robs from the affluent just to serve himself. So these are items that you could have one day and be gone the next, either because someone literally took them or life circumstances just swiped them away. Moths, rust, and thieves all represent these forces of a fallen world that destroy what we have. So earthly treasures refer to that suggested item in your Amazon list. It's like Amazon always knows what you want, right? Or the sign that says Chick-fil-A is only 2 miles away on your road trip. It's calling. You know it. It's the Lord's chicken, you know? The Spirit draws you towards that, right? Or maybe it's just the dopamine in our brains calling us that way, right? Or maybe you're like me and you just always want the latest, greatest Apple gadget that gets released every 3 or 4 months. That's me. Or maybe for you, it's pumping money into your 401k or your Roth IRA or your investment accounts, which, just be honest, they're ways of exponentially growing your money so you can all spend it on future garbage anyway. It's just 20, 30 years down the road. Or your kids' future inheritance that will ultimately be spent on stuff for them to become garbage eventually. Like, this is just the grand scheme of earthly treasures. Everything we buy is consumed. Everything we buy falls apart eventually. And when we get caught up in constantly chasing earthly treasures, perhaps that reveals a little bit of our heart's desires, doesn't it? The Apostle Paul writes this in his letter to his apprentice, Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10. You're welcome to flip there and read along with me if you choose. But here's what he writes. Yet true godliness with contentment is itself great wealth. After all, we brought nothing with us when we came into the world, and we can't take anything with us when we leave it. So if we have enough food and clothing, let us be content. Somebody needed to hear that this morning. But people who long to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many foolish and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and some people, craving money, have wandered from the true faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. So when we spend our money and we constantly invest it into earthly things, we're not just getting things that are subject to ruin, destruction, and deterioration, but when our hearts are so consumed about making the next buck or getting all of these things and purchasing more and more stuff that's just going to break down, the lust for money, the lust for more, in itself will subject ourselves to ruin, destruction, and deterioration. Money in itself isn't the issue. Money is just a tool for us to navigate this world. It's the love of money, the obsession of money that ultimately leads us down this path that just gets us crumpled up, because before you know it, the more and more we're chasing these earthly treasures for the sake of having something now that will eventually become garbage later, as that credit card interest goes up, as those exorbitant loans continue to increase, we become more and more stressed and anxious about everything we got to do to pay that off, and before you know it, that creeps into how your relationships are processed, it goes about how you manage your life, and it's a very easy way for the enemy to sneak in and take control of your life and keep you away from the freedom that Christ can bring. All because we want the next nice thing that's going to be replaced by something else down the road anyway. Like, do you see how just zooming out and looking at everything from this perspective, it puts a lot into perspective, doesn't it? So if our hearts are consumed by getting all of the earthly things we want, we will have very little left, if anything at all, to be generous towards the church, charities, and those who need it most. Just like John Wesley was at the Knight of Oxford, with nothing to give to a chambermaid, shivering in the cold because he splurged his money on pictures. So Jesus suggests an alternative place, an alternative account, if you will, for us to store up our money and to invest it, and it's specifically in the account of heaven, storing our treasure in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. And that all sounds really great, but here's the problem. Last I checked, there isn't like a national bank of heaven anywhere or some investment brokerage account of heaven that you can just put your money in. So like, what's Jesus talking about here? How can we actually store up our money in heaven? Well, let's break this down a little bit and try to understand what he's talking about. Because first, we need to understand exactly what is heaven. What is heaven? Just earlier on in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray, what is famously known as the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer opens up with this line, praying to God, "May your kingdom come soon, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So contrary to popular belief, heaven is not the separate place where our souls go when we die. It's actually the coming restoration of God's realm, the heavens. It's God's realm where he exists. And obviously he transcends this space, but he's also outside of it in the heavenly space. And there's going to come this point where our physical earthly realm is going to merge with the heavenly realms. It's going to become one again. That's why Genesis 1 and 2, the creation of Adam and Eve, were so good, because it was perfect before sin came into the picture and ripped the heavenly space and the earthly space apart, right? So now we're kind of subject to deterioration and ruin and decay because of those two things. Well, there's a time coming again when Jesus returns that's going to restore heaven and earth together, to smack them together again as one. And I love the vision we get in Revelation chapter 21. So if you want to go ahead and flip over there to Revelation chapter 1, it's towards the very end of your Bible. It's the last book of the Bible. The book of Revelation gives us a glimpse at the end times when Jesus does return and restores the earth to God's original intentions, and where we'll finally live in perfect harmony with God again, as well as the physical and the heavenly realms coming together, okay? And here's the vision of this new Jerusalem, of what this new state of being will look like at the end of all things. Here's what it says. St. John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, "Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever." And the one sitting on the throne said, "Look, I am making everything new." And then he said to me, "Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true." He also said, "It is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life. All who are victorious will inherit all these blessings, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." So when Jesus prays for God's kingdom to come soon, for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, this is the vision that he has in mind. That salvation will come to everybody, that everyone will know God, and that God will be with them, that every tear will be wiped away from their eyes, that there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain or suffering or thirst, that they will be fully restored into a relationship with God, and all their physical needs will be met to thrive in paradise under Christ, reigning as king. That's pretty rad. That's an amazing picture that we get here. So what does this mean? Storing our treasure in heaven means spending our money in ways that brings heaven closer to earth. I'll say that again. Storing our treasure in heaven means spending our money in ways that brings heaven closer to earth. Spending our money in ways that expands God's kingdom by saving souls and partners with God's will to make this world a better place. So what does that look like? Okay, there are two particular ways of how we can spend our money when we are investing in heavenly things. The first is to invest in eternal salvation. Okay? So this is putting our money into places that drive the kingdom of God further, sees disciples of Jesus made in granting them salvation so they can be saved from their sins, so that they can come and be restored in their relationship with God. This is where the whole tithing system of the Old Testament comes into play. It was literally to fund the ministry so that they can be reconciled of their sins that separated them from their relationship with God. That continued on into the early days of the church and even now to help make this whole thing happen, not just as an act of worship for God in our finances, but also so that the ministry can continue forward in so many abundant ways. So ultimately, people will come to know Jesus and be saved for eternity. And I understand that there are a lot of churches who don't spend their money on even fulfilling the Great Commission. It's just making their weekly programs and stuff happen. But the whole point of this is so that people can come to know Jesus. And so that's very much when you give to Resilient Church, when you write a check or when you give online through an offering or a tithe, it is ultimately going to this place so that we can see people come to know Jesus. And that disciples will be made and that the relationship with God will be transformed. That's why giving to the local church matters. And if there ever comes a day when you move away from Vermilion and Resilient Church, granted, we would just love everybody to stay here forever, right? Come on, just stay here. It's not too late, Hackett's. You guys can stay here. But when you do move away, then your investment hopefully can go into this new local church body. It can start here, but it can continue on to support these new churches' efforts in making disciples and making Jesus known right where you live. This especially applies to you students, especially you students listening to the podcast right now because you're traveling back from, Thanksgiving or whatever, catching up. So listen to me, all you podcast listeners out there and ourselves. Here's my dream, especially if you're a student and you feel like you don't even know how much you can give. My dream is that this place can become the space where you can create the habit of generosity. Where even if all you're giving is just $10 right now, I bet when this habit is formed with something small, when you do move away and you do get your full-time job and you get that first full-time adult paycheck, you're like, what? I'm worth this much? It's pretty amazing. The habit that you formed over time, your paycheck can now grow into that habit, right? Or maybe it was $10 before, but now it can be $250. At that next place that you go, I would so much rather you get the habit of giving here at Resilient Church so then you can go somewhere else and be a blessing next, wherever you go. Wherever you go. Now, investing in eternal salvation doesn't just stop here at Resilient Church with the local church. There are also a bunch of other missions or charities or organizations that you can give to as well that sees the expansion of the kingdom and eternal salvation come around, right? Like you can give to maybe that church camp you went to growing up, and you can help support scholarships for kids to come to know Jesus and have an amazing week of fun outdoors. Or maybe you have some friends who work with Campus Crusade or are going on missions trips or are a part of Chi Alpha or other church planting efforts. I mean, there are a number of organizations you can give towards that are seeing the expansion of the gospel across the globe. There's organizations all about Bible translating, if that's your thing. There's so many things that are all about planting churches in other countries, raising up pastors in their native languages. Right? So this is a part of like Resilient Church's own partnerships and finances as well, where we're partnering with the Timothy Initiative to plant churches globally so that we're not just seeing the gospel expand here, but around the globe. So this is one way of how you can continue to expand and invest in heaven, right? Now listen, getting the new iPhone is great and all. Getting that Christian chicken is great and all. It's also good, but let me tell you, Chipotle is even better. With that side of guac. But nothing compares to putting our money towards something that brings about salvation and deeper relationships with God. You can hear me? I'm not saying you can't get the new thing or you can't buy your Chick-fil-A. All that's fine and dandy. That's awesome. That's great. But here's what I am saying. You can't prioritize fulfilling your consumeristic desires and then say, I don't have anything to give to God. That's how you pronounce that. With the alternating caps. It's true, isn't it? You can't prioritize fulfilling your consumeristic desires and then say, I don't have anything to give to God. I've heard it said that hardly generosity is ever a matter of math. It's never a math issue, it's a heart issue. Okay? We have to prioritize giving first and then conform our life around it. And whatever that looks like for us, in proportion to your sacrifice, right? So that's the first way of how we can store up our treasure in heaven, by investing in the expansion of eternal salvation. But the second way we can store up our treasures in heaven is by investing in human flourishing. This is one of my favorites. This image that we get in Revelation shows this new heaven and earth coming together where there is no more suffering, there's no more pain, there's no more death or poverty or tears or anything that brings about destruction. Everyone has their needs met to fully flourish as God designed them to in the new heavens and the new earth. So one other way we can invest in heaven is through contributing to causes and efforts that boost human flourishing. We actually get a glimpse of this in 2 Corinthians when Paul is commending the Macedonian churches who were eager to give to the Jerusalem church specifically to help them with their needs during a famine, to help this church flourish in a time of suffering and scarcity. The book of James in the Bible talks about giving to the poor, helping with widows. Jesus even talks about, tells a rich man to give away everything he owns and give it to the poor. Why? It's to assist in human flourishing. It's to assist in human flourishing. So at Resilient Church, we've done a number of ways of how we can also partner with organizations and bring about the human flourishing, right? To help bring heaven a little closer to earth. One of the ways we're doing that is by taking our second missions trip to Juarez, Mexico. $15,000 is all it takes for our team to raise to build a family, a completely new home that will completely change this family's life for generations to come, to help them flourish. And we also get to partner with local churches and share the gospel with this family too, down there in Juarez. So they also have the chance of receiving eternal salvation. I mean, that's just a one and done deal. That's amazing, right? But this is also why we're giving away money every single month to charities to make Vermilion a better place this year in our generosity initiatives, right? So in August, we gave $1,000 to SESDAC to support their work with disabled people, that give them care, support, and job training so that they can flourish. September, we gave $1,000 to the USD Counseling Services to help expand services that tend to students' mental health so that they can be more mentally whole and can flourish. In October, we gave to the Salvation Army, which helps with a number of provisions for those in poverty, particularly with housing needs in Vermilion, so that they can flourish. And as we've been talking about this month, we partnered with the food pantry, not just in giving that $1,000 contribution, but also for people to bring in food of their own, so that the hungry can be fed, and they can flourish. So that's what we're doing as a church. How can you also be doing that yourself, even with your own finances? I mean, chances are you know of plenty of organizations and charities that you can give your money towards that helps bring about human flourishing. Just to name a couple on my list, Call to Freedom in Sioux Falls. It's a nonprofit that seeks to eradicate sex trafficking and helps victims recover. Halfway Houses are nonprofits that help ex-criminals get back on their feet and adjust to life after prison. To Write Love on Her Arms is a nonprofit that provides hope and healing to those suffering from suicide, depression, addiction, and self-harm. Fight the New Drug is a nonprofit that teaches about the harmful effects of pornography, helping people break from their sex addictions. Organizations like World Vision and World Hope allow you to sponsor a child for $20 a month, providing them education, food, and clean water in a third world country, all for a month. That's how much my breakfast costed the other day. Put that in perspective. And I mean, there's just actually like maybe giving something to the homeless person on the corner of the street. Yeah, I don't know what they're going to do with that money. Nobody does. Maybe he needs it. Maybe he'll spoil it. Who knows? But at the very least, these are ways of how we can try to partner with people and organizations to bring heaven a little closer to earth, to wipe away tears from everyone's eyes, to bring about human flourishing where everyone has their needs met. The list never ends. The list never ends, okay? So again, hear me. Your 20-ounce vanilla bean frappuccino is fine. Getting your new car is fine. Buying Chipotle is fine. Investing in your retirement is fine. But how different does it feel in your soul when you can say, I'm going to prioritize my money in a way that brings heaven closer to earth, first and foremost, and then I'm going to adapt the rest of my lifestyle around that. I love what St. Basil, who was a monk who lived hundreds of years ago, wrote about how to make the world a better place. And he simply said this: simplify your life so you have more to give with others. Simplify your life so that you have more to give to others. We'll invite our worship team back up here as we close. Move into our response time. Paul concludes his letter to Timothy, a letter of a church, a leader of a church in the ancient city of Ephesus. Okay, he's going back to his apprentice. He closes his letter with these words, and I think it just applies to us so powerfully today. To teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future, so that they may experience true life. You know what true life is? Eternal life with God forever, when heaven and earth meet. Something that John Wesley says is that he challenges us as believers to make as much money as we can. We should be good workers who truly strive to do the best that we can, to make as much money as we can, but we should also be good stewards of that and to save as much money as we can, right? Don't spend it on just stuff that's just gonna go to trash. Save as much as we can to provide for our needs. But there's a third piece that we gotta do, is to give as much as we can. You can make all this money for yourself and you can store it all for yourself, but it's going to go and just fly away eventually anyway. What ultimately it comes down to is to give away as much as we can in proportion to our unique seasons of life. Make as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can. So what does that look like for you? As we've been talking about these last couple of weeks, we are trying to challenge our church body with giving, to try tithing to the local church. Maybe this is the first time you've ever done it. Maybe you are feeling pulled to increase your gift to match closer to that 10% or whatever it is that God's laying on your heart. We're doing it with a 90-day money-back guarantee where like February 10th, we'll send out a text that says, hey, the 90 days is over. We'd love to hear how God moved. And if you need a refund of all of your funds, if testing God with giving and your generosity to this place was a stretch for you, you reach out to us. We will refund everything back to you over the last 3 months. No questions asked. But this is kind of our last week where we're really trying to have that push. If God's calling you to grow in your generosity, that we can set up that gift. You can do so through Church Center. If you have the app, you can set up a recurring donation, so you don't even have to think about it. You can systematize that act of worship. If you need to set it up, you can scan the QR code on that black Connect card, and you can, at the top of the link, top of the page, you'll be able to set up giving from there, right? Respond as you will. But I also wonder, how can we even continue to partner with God in ways that bring heaven a little close? Who's that person that could use an extra buck or two? Is there a charity that you really want to support? Or these extra efforts that we can do that just helps partner with God in expanding the kingdom and bringing about human flourishing? So I just want to close to remind us of our core phrase one last time. That God doesn't want your money. He wants your heart. And since our heart is often consumed by our money, God uses our money to fund the ministry that changes our hearts and the world, I might add. This time is yours to respond. How you see fit.